So welcome everybody. On behalf of the C20, of the Civil 20, I want to thank RACI and Juliana and the organizer of this meeting that we consider a C20 event and not just a side event, because it's focusing on a relevant and fundamental issue for us as civil society. There is the issue of participation and of freedoms and democracy. As a civil society, as Civil 20, that is the engagement group of the G20, we gather civil society from all over the world to put in place a dialogue with the G20, asking the G20 to not act as if they were the world government, but to strengthen the UN process, the multilateral process, using human rights as the guiding ethical compass. And one of the fundamental elements is the possibility to have a say, to participate. And we are facing a continuing process of shrinking of civic spaces, and that is sadly not new. And that's the reason why in this central day of the C20 Summit, it was important for us have a moment all together to reflect on the risk that as civil society we are facing, meeting, and on the importance and the relevance to have this, to make this exercise of freedom, exercise of participation, that at the end is an exercise of dignity. So thank you, Juliana, to lead us in this discussion today. I leave the floor to you with, again, a very big thank and a very big even if almost virtual hug from all the C20 constituency to the panelists, but also to the attendees in this final session of the second day of the C20 Summit.
Thank you, Ricardo, and thank you for letting us address this very important topic, and this central topic, especially what the world is facing during the pandemic. And as we gather here as civil society to discuss several issues and recommendations to give the G20 countries, we cannot avoid this central topic that the world is facing, because as you know, during the pandemic, there has been a lot of restrictions to fundamental freedoms, and many states all over the world has used the pandemic as an excuse to introduce restrictions to the civic space. And of course, this produce a shrinking in civic space, which is the space that give us the freedom as civil society organizations and citizens in general to discuss different topics that citizens need to address. So we are very thankful to be talking about this, and we have a very special and interesting panel to address this topic. I will introduce the panelists today and thank them all because they are in different parts of the world and different time zones. So thank you very much. We have Mariana Belalba Barreto. She is Civic Space Cluster Lead at Civicus. We have Florence Navasivke. She is Legal Advisor at ICNL, which is International Center for Not-Profit Law. We have Ania Bosikova-Antopska. She's the Policy and Advocacy Coordinator at the Balkan Civil Society Development Network. And finally, we have Harsh Haitley. He is the Chief Executive Officer at Bani India. How we are going to organize today this event? We're going to start with Mariana and Florence. They're going to give a general overview of this, of what is happening with the enabling environment in the world today due to the pandemic, and they will share some facts and figures that will help us then discuss the topic. And then we're going to focus specifically in some regions to know and to identify practices that have been going on in those regions and in those countries, and also to see some good practices that organizations in those regions has been doing, of course, to struggle and to avoid and fight against these restrictions to enabling environment. So we're gonna talk about what's happening in Latin America, in Africa, in the Balkans, and in India and Asia in general. So after this introduction, we're gonna let Mariana. I'm gonna stop sharing screen so she can share her presentation on what is happening within a neighboring environment. So Mariana, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Juliana, and everyone for the opportunity, as you mentioned, to share this important resource of what are the civic space conditions, or what has happened during the pandemic. But before I address what has been the impact of COVID-19, of the pandemic, on the ability of people to exercise these rights, I thought it was very important to kind of contextualize where we were before the pandemic started. As many of you know, civic space condition has been deteriorating for the past few years. So the starting point of the pandemic was already increasing restrictions for the ability of people to speak out, to take to the street, or to associate. As you can see from the graphic, over 80% of the world population actually live in countries where the civic space rating is rated as closed, repressed, or obstructed. In practical terms, this means that people living in these countries, of the majority of people, is either impossible to exercise these freedoms, or they actually face significant challenge when they take to the street to protest, or when they try to organize. And only very few people, 3% of the population, are actually able to protest, to speak out, without having to face major consequences. So as you can see, the initial panorama of civic space was already worrisome. This challenge, unfortunately, kind of increased during the pandemic. As Juliana mentioned, we have documented how a state have used the pandemic as a justification to further restrict on civic space freedoms. Only a month after the pandemic was declared, we issued a report where we actually were documenting how states have used unjustified restrictions on access to information. We saw that initially with China, in Turkmenistan, where it was almost impossible to even mention the word coronavirus, or in El Salvador, where journalists could not ask questions related to the virus, or the imposition of censorship. Under this need of the states to control the information, or to prevent the information to be disseminated, we also saw the detention of activists for disseminating information related to COVID-19. We saw, for example, in Thailand, where an activist posted a Facebook post about how there was no equipment at the airport to screen about COVID-19, and he was subsequently detained because of that post. We also have seen how governments also took advantage of this pandemic and continue their crackdown, detaining human rights defenders. And I'm sure ICNL will expand a little bit more on this, but also at the beginning, the enactment of overly broad emergency powers that actually enable the government to pass legislation that restricts these rights without no oversight. As the months continue, we actually document, this is a report a year after the pandemic, how government continue to restrict the right to freedom of expression. One of the main trends that we have documented is that the inability of governments to disseminate information, prompt information about COVID-19. Instead, they went out of their way to censor content related to COVID-19 and actually to enact or amend legislation related to fake news or disinformation. And we can see that was very prevalent in Asia Pacific, in Central Asia, in Europe. We document that at least 37 countries either enact legislation or amend legislation to curb the spread as what they call fake news. But what happened is they just criminalize the free flow of information. This trend was particularly prevalent. Over half of the countries who enact this type of legislation were rated as repressed or obstructed by the Civicus Monitor, meaning there were already significant restrictions on civic space. Although at the beginning of the pandemic, we saw a little bit of a halt or a stop of massive protest movements taking to the street, we also start seeing how eventually people start taking to the street and protest. We saw that with Black Lives Matter, that became a global movement, and many other protests demanding the end of some cases of COVID-19 measures, but also because COVID-19 exacerbated the inequalities that where we were living. The response of the government were not a surprise. We have been documented a crackdown on the right to protest for many years, but during the pandemic was especially telling how governments use as an excuse to use excessive force to disrupt and to despair protests. We saw this in many countries from Brazil, France, Indonesia, and many others. We actually document that at least 79 countries use excessive force to disperse protests during the year of the pandemic. And also, and I think a little bit more telling of how the government used this as an excuse is the detention of protesters. We document that in at least 100 countries, government detained people who took to the street. This means that they took people out of the open air and locked them down in often overcrowded prison under the pretext of try to curb the spread of the virus. Obviously, this could have had the opposite end of that. We documented this in many regions, as you can see from the graphic. It's pretty much spread among Europe, Central Asia, and the Americas, where people took to the street a little bit more. And I'm going to finalize by saying that we have all of these resources very well documented, how government has gone beyond what international law allows them to limit human rights during a health emergency, and have gone beyond that. We're especially concerned about the enactment or amendment of legislation about fake news. We think this could be used, and it's been used now, but could be used in the years to come to just crack down on this end. So we call the government to just repeal this type of legislation and enable the free dissemination of information. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mariana, for sharing this data that is very helpful to think and to have an overview of the different type of tools that government use to restrict civic space in the world, and the examples you give. Thank you very much, Mariana. We can continue with Florence. She's also going to share screen the presentation, and she's going to focus on especially the legal tools that governments use to justify restrictions. And of course, this affects directly democracy all over the world. So thank you very much, Florence.
Thank you very much, Juliana, and to all the panelists. It's a pleasure to join you today. I just want to start off by saying that the International Center for Not-for-Profit Law, ICNL, we have started off by appreciating that when we are dealing with the COVID emergency response, we are dealing with a pandemic that is also creating a parallel human rights crisis. This is because of the way the emergency measures have been introduced. The content in themselves has not been consistent with the applicable human rights norms, which should have been a key criteria, but also how they are enforced. So the state conduct in how the measures are being implemented has been a concern. At ICNL, we have been monitoring government responses to the pandemic through our COVID-19 Civic Freedoms Tracker, which we created right at the start of the pandemic in March 2020, which we undertook in collaboration with the UN Special Rapporteur on Counterterrorism. The tracker has covered 178 countries globally, and from the measures that we have seen, of the 178 countries we have monitored, 109 have issued emergency declarations, which have different components and restrictions on human rights. 58 of those have also introduced measures that affect fundamentally freedom of expression and media freedom, as Civic has also highlighted. A significant number of the countries we have seen have also adopted measures that have affected assembly rights, as you would naturally expect. The pandemic has brought into fore the restrictions on movement, and assemblies have been significantly affected. And then 61 countries have also introduced measures that are affecting privacy rights. Now, in terms of the key trends that we are seeing on how the emergency measures have constrained civic space and also endangering democracy, here I'm providing 6 key trends. And you can also see this on our website and ICNA website, where we provide this analysis. One is the way the emergency measures have been introduced. We are seeing a tilting in the balance of power towards the executive and a weakening of democratic checks and balances. In some countries, we have seen that COVID-19 emergency measures are empowering the executive and weakening other branches of government. In countries like Hungary and Malaysia, we saw the suspension of parliament, allowing for government to rule and issue declarations without parliamentary approval. And even in Hungary, where we saw the government, the prime minister, who was granted powers to rule by decree. Again, we saw the suspension of judicial mechanisms as another branch of government, and therefore inhibiting access to redress and justice for CSOs who either want to challenge problematic laws that were passed or implemented during the pandemic, or even to get redress for victims who are facing violations. Again, we have seen the use of the emergency measures by governments like China and in Russia, where they have taken an authoritarian approach to the pandemic and touted it as appropriate and therefore ideal, which is also undermining democratic norms and overriding those standards. Our message is that there's a number of good practices that show that it is possible to protect democracy and public health. The two should not be seen as antagonistic to the other. The second one that we are seeing, again, are these constraints on public participation, especially for civil society, in playing a role in the COVID response, as well as the recovery process. This has fundamentally affected civil society that are providing medical aid and relief, who have been blocked through the management or the enforcement of curfews and stay-at-home orders in countries like Burkina Faso, as well as Belize, which have been used against CSOs. And in countries like Rwanda, where we have seen that CSOs have been arrested for violating social distancing rules and orders. Again, in other countries, we have seen that CSOs who are providing protective gear against the pandemic have also been arrested. In Cameroon, where they have been subjected to 4 years imprisonment for engaging during the pandemic in violation of stay-at-home orders. What we have seen is that whereas emergency orders were issued in terms of restricting movement, there was a cluster of essential workers, which sadly did not recognize CSOs that are responding to the pandemic. And this has generated a lot of tension with CSOs who are actually legitimately responding and supporting marginalized groups as a result. Again, when it comes to participation, we have also seen the unintended consequences of shifting meetings and public hearings online by governments in a bid to contain the spread. Whereas that has been an innovative way of engaging with the public, we are also seeing that it has also entrenched the digital divide. Groups that were already marginalized on the digital front to access online platforms have now been entirely excluded to engage in those processes that government is doing through their response to COVID-19 online. So again, that has been a key concern that we have highlighted. Now, another concern that we have observed is the way the governments have exploited the pandemic to generally restrict key fundamental rights. As I highlighted earlier, one of which has been bans on protests and demonstrations. The key concern here has been the lack of recognition of exceptions to socially distanced for instance, gatherings that would allow for adherence to public health protocols. So this has undermined peaceful protests, and it has particularly affected human rights defenders as well as political opposition groups who have been selectively targeted for convening public meetings that have been considered violating public health guidelines. In Russia, we saw opposition members who were confined to house arrest for convening public meetings in violation of COVID-19 rules. In Hong Kong as well, we also saw authorities arresting people for holding illegal assemblies. Now, the failure to accommodate, again, exceptions where protests are held in a safe environment has been a key concern. And what we are seeing is that also a number of these measures have not had an expiration date that, again, is providing a lot of opportunity for misuse. And then the other one that we are seeing is around freedom of expression, and I think Civic has already pointed to this. I want to just highlight that we have seen an increasing use of fake news and disinformation laws being used to target independent voices and to penalize criticism and dissent of government responses to the pandemic. Again, whereas there might be a legitimate reason to assist in providing reliable information, the misuse and censorship of those who are providing critical information about the pandemic has been seen as a growing trend and a risk to democratic systems where the pandemic responses are happening. We have seen also that using these laws in a number of countries, the laws themselves have used vaguely worded provisions, including causing uncertainty in Bolivia, where the law actually penalizes spreading of information that causes uncertainty. And the penalty there is up to 10 years imprisonment. In Zimbabwe, where providing false information about the government pandemic response can be subject to a sentence of 20 years imprisonment. Now, these are some of the extreme cases that we have seen. Using these laws, we have seen cases where governments are prosecuting journalists as well as human rights activists for speaking out and sharing information. And then the other one we are seeing is the barriers around access to information. In some governments, like in Brazil, in Tanzania, they have suspended access to information laws and failed to provide reliable information, comprehensive and transparent to the public around the COVID response and how resources are being managed. Again, we are also seeing targeting of whistleblowers who are sharing information on the extent of the crisis, who are being, again, prosecuted. We saw cases in China, in Egypt, and in Tanzania, among others. And lastly, we are also seeing a lot of threats around digital technologies, the use of intrusive surveillance technologies, which are being, again, misused in a way that undermines the right to privacy, especially of critical voices like human rights defenders. Here we are seeing CCTV facial recognition systems that have been introduced in a number of countries. In Moscow, there was 100,000 new city-wide CCTV system that were established in response to the pandemic. Again, even the way we have also seen the use of bracelets for tracking monitors of those who are under quarantine in a number of countries have also been a dangerous precedent. What we are seeing is that whereas we started off with legitimate objectives on actually creating these technologies, it's going to be a lasting legacy because it's unclear how this information is being shared, and the lack of adequate oversight and data protection safeguards is a key concern that we would want G20 Summit leaders and the international community to pay regard to. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Florence, for this information and everything that you point out. I have highlighted some of the things that both Mariana and Florence mentioned and how these things are mining democracy. I put here the use of fake news, the excessive use of force in protest, the barriers to access to information, the intrusive surveillance and using technology for this, the suspension of parliamentary sessions and limit in protests and demonstrations. These are some of the examples that you both share as the context in the world. So now we're going to focus on some regions. We're going to start with Anya in the Balkans, and then with Harsh in India. And the idea is to see if you can share what practices that you identified, some of these practices or new ones or other difference that are mining democracy in your regions and that are shrinking the neighboring environment. And of course, to share with us what CSOs, what organizations have been doing to avoid and fight against this, or what recommendations would you give to organizations that want to fight against this? And both of you belong to network organizations, so also how working with peers and in networks help also to cope and to work against this and to fight against these restrictions. So Anya, if you want, you can start with your discussion.
Thank you, Juliana. Thanks for the invitation to participate in this very relevant panel. I'm happy to be among you all. So VCSDN, the Balkan Civil Society Development Network, has been monitoring for years now the enabling environment for civil society in our region through our monitoring matrix tool, and in the last several years as well through the Civic monitor. And of course, we've continued to provide to do this monitoring in light of COVID-19. And what we've seen in general is pretty similar to what was mentioned before. And even though the legal environment in these countries didn't change much, in practice, civic space has been shrinking. And now the biggest challenge is how to overturn this continued downward trend. The systems of the Western Balkan countries were already fragile before the pandemic, and this crisis led to an even higher crisis of democracy, challenged principles of good governance and accountability, because authorities were selectively, arbitrarily applying restrictions that were oftentimes disproportionate to the threat they were addressing, and thus were curtailing basic freedoms. And the worrisome situation in this is that although it was aimed to protect the public health, it was often used as an excuse to target those that were critical. In terms of COVID-19 restrictions, most affected were, of course, freedom of assembly and expression. And due to the full partial bans of gatherings, curfews, even restrictions of movement, which caused problems to regular service provision of CSOs, as they didn't get permits, much like the other service providers, and then civil society reacted in order to be able to do this. Because of all these restrictions, of course, in general, there were less protests, let's say, than the years before, but civil society did find creative ways, symbolic ways to protest, and especially organized a lot of protests on environment issues that have affected the lives of local communities and so on. And even though, let's say, there were less protests, there were more selective actions of excessive use of force, of imposing fines and detentions. For example, interrupting gatherings, which were in a way on the pretense of not respecting COVID rules, but on the other hand, allowing other gatherings to take place, which were more in line with the positions of the government. In terms of freedom of expressions, again, the limitations were related to the measures in place. Access to information was restricted. There were governments who limited the persons who were allowed to share official information. They even restricted the presence of some journalists on press conferences and so on. And of course, people were not that many, but there were detentions and arrests on grounds of spreading fake news, causing panic, insulting public officials when these measures were criticized. We also monitor the participation of CSOs and the cooperation between CSOs and government. And it was obvious that despite the experience of CSOs in providing services necessary in such a crisis, despite the expertise they have in areas that are affected by states of emergency, measures enacted within the states of emergencies, CSOs in most of the cases, in most of the countries in this region, have not been included in the national coordinated crisis responses, have not even been consulted and participating in the decision-making processes or even the crisis bodies. Only in some countries, but to a very limited extent, CSOs benefited from the support measures like employment, subsidies, and so on. But on the other hand, and very importantly, CSOs funding notably decreased throughout the region due to shifted priorities, of course, for the government, which showed how the governments don't see funding and supporting CSOs in the country as a priority. And as much as this is not surprising, it is a paradox in a way when you think how much CSOs did actually invest in helping people affected by the pandemic and basically took over the government's responsibilities in handling the crisis. So this brings me to what did CSOs do in the pandemic? What did they do to avoid this situation, to fight against this? And how they engaged during the pandemic. So the pandemic obviously had a very big effect on the operations and capacities on CSOs, put their sustainability of risk, but still it didn't take long for CSOs to adjust and find ways, tools to meet their goals and reach their constituencies. One of the positive sides of this whole situation is that the pandemic prompted CSOs to establish new practices for communication, presented a new opportunity to move communication activities to the now expanding virtual space on the expense of the shrinking civic physical space, and have prompted them to more effectively, regularly use different online social media tools. And this in turn has led to increased visibility of CSOs and recognition of their work by the public. On the other hand, as I said, not recognized still by the governments. Despite that lack of recognition, CSOs were driven by their self-initiative and greatly contributed in filling the gaps and responding to the needs of citizens, especially most vulnerable, marginalized groups, from organizing food delivery, medicine delivery, to helping the elderly, to sewing masks, to helping women, people in rural areas, and so on. And in addition to assisting all of these groups to meet their basic needs affected by the crisis, CSOs have showed that they were the key actors focused on upholding the respect of democracy and protecting the human rights and freedoms in their watchdog role. So monitoring and analyzing the impact of the crisis, CSOs have advocated for the interests and rights of the people they represent by continuously submitting requests, proposals to public institutions and pushing for the necessary changes. And for example, there have been many examples like this, organizations coming together, for example, organizations in Bosnia working on democracy, human rights, they reorganize their resources in order to engage in monitoring the crisis management, raising alarms about substantial human rights violations, and fighting disinformation. And this has been in other countries as well. And for example, as well, gender issues, maybe they were not a priority in the pandemic management, sometimes even not even considered at all. But women organizations were very active because of that in pursuing their advocacy efforts. And for example, in North Macedonia, the National Network for Ending Violence Against Women pushed the government to amend restrictions on free movement. In Kosovo, the Women Network as well introduced some changes to the restrictions, and the government considered this advocacy. And these are just some examples out of many that bring me to the last point of why networking, collaborations, cooperation between civil society is crucial. Cooperation on national level gives stronger voice to CSOs, allows CSOs to pool their resources together towards a common goal and put more pressure on governments. And regional international cooperation allows us to learn from each other, to share experiences in dealing with these issues. Because just like we see the negative trends of shrinking civic space spread easily from one country to another, it's even more important to see how cooperation across borders or sectors helps us find the most effective ways to fight back. And now more than ever, it is necessary for the whole society to work together, civil society, private sector, academia, media, and every other actor in society to mitigate the negative effects of the pandemic, which will last for a while, but also to stimulate and keep the democratic debate going. And I will just finish on the note that CSOs really need to connect, cooperate, and learn from each other more to pursue joint advocacy objectives and act in solidarity. because this might be one of the most powerful tools that civil society has to protect civic space and promote an enabling environment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anya, for all these interesting things that you share about what happened in your region. And thank you very much, of course, to giving these creative or share these creative ways that organizations in the Balkan have reached to cope with these difficulties. It gives us a little bit of light under at the end of the tunnel. So thank you for sharing this. Very, very much interesting. We're going to continue with Harsh. He's also addressing what happened and which ways did the Indian civil society organizations started using to cope with this reality. So Harsh, if you're going to continue.
Thank you, Juliana. And it's very nice to see all the colleagues, at least on the Zoom platform, because we have not met and talked to each other for almost 2 years. And Ricardo and all, we were supposed to be very effective, physical meetings during C20, but now we are into this whole process since last, I think, Saudi Arabia, and I don't know how long it will continue, but thank you very much for this opportunity. See, interestingly, our analysis, like my analysis is something, it's like this, that, there has been a very systematic attack on the civil society globally to make it weak. That no one wanted to see a strong civil society in their system, whether it's a government, whether it's a private sector. Everyone in every country wanted that we need a very weak civil society, which is dependent on us on everything. To get that, they have been doing almost for 2 decades, we have seen, at least in India and other countries, that they changed their laws. They changed their laws in such a way that you can't save anything. Like in India, income tax law says that you can't save money. You have to spend whatever you get, otherwise we will put tax on you. They say that you can't generate resources that much, you have to spend everything. So financially, everyone tried to make civil society financially weak through these laws. The second thing they did, that a negative narrative was generated by the ruling elite in the country, globally, locally, that how to question the legitimacy of civil society through false media, through campaigns, through negative narratives all around. So all these things were there already. But what happened that COVID, the nature and the scale of COVID was such that it exposed the fault lines in every system. If you say in my country, if you see in the United States, even in US and UK, European countries, the COVID exposed the weakness of the medical system, health system, everything. In our country also, it went like this. So it also exposed the fault line of the way in which civil society was treated in these countries. Because if you see, before that, we are not new to natural crises like disasters, floods, earthquakes everywhere in the world. And civil society, we know, is always first to respond to that situation, because we are there with the people. So we have to respond the first. The government comes later, but immediately in the village level, in the forest, civil society responds to that crisis, always. But this time, the scale was not local, the scale was global. So it was beyond the capacity of even civil society. It was beyond the capacity of even governments to handle that. So first lesson, all of us, we learned that no government or no civil society in a private sector can alone handle a crisis of such scale, which humanity has not seen in the recent history. So in that crisis, they realized that, oh God, now what to do? So even say, if you are reading about India, you will find that suddenly lockdown was announced. Now, when suddenly lockdown was announced, people were, they were concerned about their livelihood, especially the migrant workers who were coming from rural to urban India to work in the cities. So they started migrating because they thought they are not going to get food, they are not going to get health services, they are going to get no job. So not only the pandemic started in this country in 2020 March, it also started a huge population of migrant workers, children, walking down to their villages on the roads. So that crisis came and no one was able to handle that crisis. So it was the civil society which came out to handle that crisis. But as I said, civil society had no resources. They had no financial resources, because those who, my colleagues in Civicus and ICNL will agree if they have studied about India, as I know they do study a lot because we work with them very closely. And you will find that in the last few years, even the foreign funding laws have been so restrictive that there is foreign funding in India is going down tremendously. We have last 5 years a very good CSR company, providing support to Indian civil society. But just before pandemic, our Prime Minister came with PM Care program, and he asked money from all the companies. So the whole CSR money, the whole private sector money, the all funding from philanthropists went to the Prime Minister Care Office. So civil society had literally no resources from anywhere to handle and provide services at that stage. So I'll say, sir, that not only there was a obvious head-on attempt to restrict the space by changing laws related to foreign funding in India, like it was done in 2020. There was a amendment in foreign funding laws in India. There was a changes in income tax laws, because due to pandemic, there was no debate in the parliament. So they started that every 5 years you have to renew your charitable status. Every 5 years you have to renew your foreign funding license. So these attempts were going on along with the COVID crisis, which was there outside. The worst was that no one can go out. No one, as other colleagues have said, that outside there is a curfew. You can't go out. If you even want to distribute food, you need to have a permission from local administration. That shows that there was a, you have to, even to provide basic services to people, you need a permission from the police and local administration. Then compliance. To do that compliance, otherwise your NGO will be closed. But for that compliance also, you can't go out. For that, you also need a permission. So it was like an overall crisis which civil society faced, I will say that way. And then, as other colleagues are saying, that what happened in our country was that in the first wave, there was not much crisis. It was manageable. We were providing medicines to other countries also. We started producing vaccines also. And there was a feeling of saying that we have victory over the COVID came. And even our Prime Minister said that, oh, we have now won the war against COVID, and there was political crisis and everything. So the second wave came to India. And you must have seen that was the worst wave, because they were not prepared. There was no oxygen, there was no medicine. The number of people who got sick and died was huge. And everyone in the government tried to, manipulate that statistics and not to give that exact figures. But it was the civil society, I will say, that without proper training, our frontline workers went out to provide services to people. Many of them lost their own lives. So if you go to WANI website, we have started a process in which we are listing that how many frontline workers have lost their lives. But since civil society is in an economic crisis, most of frontline workers in our sector do not have social security. So when they died, their families were without any basic services. So we're working how we can give them services. So it was like, I will say,
Harsh, I think we miss you.
In that crisis was that those who study about Indian civil society, they know that we have a group of civil society who came out of.
I think we are missing now, Harsh, the connection.
So we started a process that we said, you share with us your experiences. People started using social media to talk about their innovations, to talk about their challenges. A spirit of sharing their lessons and learning to each other started. I think that was the major achievement. Second achievement was Zoom became a major tool about the dialogue within the civil society, within the experts and everywhere. Otherwise, we see that civil society at grassroots levels, they were not so comfortable in speaking in public domain when they used to come to public meetings. But now, since they were sitting in their secure places, and actually WANI, bought a space in Zoom, and we shared that with everyone, that why don't we talk on regional languages and various issues. So I think the civil society in India, at least, maybe globally in your countries also, became very friendly and aware, and they started using social media to talk about their work. So I think there is pros and cons. And the last, I will not take much of your time. I should not exceed that time. But the last question is that how we can do. See, whether you talk about civil society in C20 or G20, UN, we have seen that in such a crisis of this level, UN could not do anything. WHO is still struggling to provide vaccines to countries which can't afford it. And some countries are having too much of vaccines. They call it vaccines nationalism is going on, right? So all these structures which were created all around us between government to government, they started failing. Every government is worried about their own plate of food and not worried about the others can get that food or not. I think the time has come that we are working on this All of us should work on that. We should work about the civil society to civil society relationship. Something like South-South cooperation, North-South cooperation, that how we can work beyond that. And I'm telling you, Ricardo, we are having BRICS, civil BRICS in India, and BRICS is going to have the same fate as the SARC had. You know, South Asian Association of Regional Cooperation is not functional at all because of India-Pakistan relationship. We are not going to have BRICS. BRICS is going to vanish due to China and all those. How future, I don't know, C20, what will happen in future, G20, what will happen in future, but at least we should have a strong civil society cooperation to manage this situation, to learn from each other and to learn these lessons. Thank you.
Thank you, Harsh, for all this information. I was thinking something that you said, that the COVID exposed the weaknesses of some states or most of the states in terms of medicines, in terms of economic things, in terms of education. But you said that also exposed how countries and states treated civil society inside their own countries. And that's something that we have to think about, because that is how they acted or reacted afterwards in consequence on how they treat us. And as Anya mentioned, we were the ones that we are in the front line during the COVID, but then we are not gathered when there's public policies to discuss, on our opinions are not taken into account when we have to take important decisions. So this is something that we have to take in common, and of course, something that the pandemic exposed at the eyes of all those citizens. So we have some time left, some minutes left, and we're gonna finish with Mariana and Florence with some minutes so they can share what happened in Latin America. When Mariana mentioned some examples in some countries, in Bolivia and El Salvador, and also Florence, you mentioned something about Africa also. Just some minutes to mention if you can see some related things as Harsh and Anya mentioned in the regions, and how organizations are working on this. So Mariana, if you want to start with Latin America.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. Yeah, I think the continent has seen similarities with what has been previously spoken, but also with the global overview that we share. We have seen the same restrictions happening, in addition to like a further crackdown on certain countries that were very visible, like Cuba, Nicaragua, or the crackdown on protests that happened in Colombia. But just to focus on what civil society have done, and to build upon what Anja mentioned about the importance of collective and networking action. Some of the examples that we have documented where civil society has pushed back and have won, it has been instance of collective action. There has been a few proposals of restrictive legislation, I think in Honduras and Nicaragua, that were actually revoked due to civil society pushing back against that. So those are some winnings that civil society can attest for. On unlikely allies, I think Anja also mentioned that how civil society or people from different sectors came together. We also saw that happening in Nicaragua and in Guatemala, where civil society health professionals came together to demand the government to provide access to reliable information about COVID-19. But I want to focus also on the importance of civil society. I think Harsh mentioned that recently, and which is the conclusion I want to give here, is that at the core of all of this has been the increment of restrictions, but civil society has never been silenced. Like even when restrictions increase, civil society continued to push back. But I think what is more telling is that exactly civil society actually filled the gaps where governments were unable to provide service for civil society. We saw, for example, in Brazil, in Nicaragua, and in Argentina, how civil society got together to create projects and initiatives to curb the disinformation or the lack of information on COVID-19 by the government. I think it was also a regional initiative in Latin America that was able to kind of go around the censorship that governments were providing. So you could have a whole report called Solidarity in Times of COVID with like hundreds of examples of civil society organizations stepping up when the government couldn't do it because of gender-based violence in Mexico and many other instances where civil society was able to provide service. And without civil society organizations during this year, I don't know where it would be at. Thank you.
Thank you, Mariana. Florence, you want to share also about what's happening in Africa?
Yes, thank you once again, and the panelists for those insights. I think, again, a lot of similarities, but maybe just to underscore that in Africa, of course, we've been particularly concerned with the sustenance of the emergency declarations for the longest period, even where they have not been reviewed, where the situation is changing or evolving. That has been a primary concern. We've seen like 17 countries have instituted the state of emergencies, but only 11 that we are tracking have lapsed them. There are still others that are still sustaining those, and that has been a concern. The legislative processes have also been exploited because of the lack of civil society engagement during the pandemic and the restrictions of movement. We have seen also new measures of constraining civil society through anti-money laundering and counter-terrorism financing measures, which have been also put in place in this period where there is no civil society oversight. The securitization of the response has also been a big problem, with the way the military have been deployed and seizing law enforcement authorities to manage and oversee the pandemic. The lack of accountability and inadequate oversight in the way they are exercising their emergency powers continues to be a problem. And of course, just to zero down on how civil society have engaged and pushed back on this, one has been, again, intensifying their watchdog role. For the government's lack of providing reliable information, we have seen CSOs taking the proactive effort of creating websites. In Zimbabwe, there's a Veritas website which has been created to share information about what's happening in Parliament so that the public is empowered. We have also seen civil society coming up in anti-corruption campaigns to expose the mismanagement of COVID resources. Follow the Money have created a spreadsheet which tracks donor funding in response to COVID-19. In Malawi and South Africa, we have seen the rise of protests, again, calling out on the mismanagement of resources. And in Malawi, actually, there was a big success because as a result of civil society campaign, the government instituted an audit, and public officials that were implicated for misusing COVID funds were dismissed, including the labor minister. Civil society are also taking active role in terms of building navigation and resilience resources to support each other in responding effectively to the constraints on civic space during the pandemic. And I think just also to finish on the role of strategic litigation, which has been another tool that civil society have engaged in to push back. One, challenging the inadequate access to reliable information from the government. We have seen that being addressed in Zimbabwe and in Kenya. The absence of parliamentary approval in passage of COVID rules and regulations has also been challenged in Kenya. The police violence in enforcing COVID measures has also been challenged in countries like Kenya and Lesotho as well. So Kenya has been really robust in using public litigation tools. And also in Malawi, where we have seen CSOs challenging the issuance of the state of emergency declaration in the absence of safety nets for vulnerable groups, which the High Court again successfully issued an order against the government for doing so. So we've seen some inroads in that regard. I think I'll finish at that and just say, of course, the role of civil society cannot be overstated when it comes to providing the protection of human rights in the COVID response, and that we are increasingly looking out on how states provide that space and the resources for civil society to be included in the COVID response. And looking as we look towards recovery phases of the COVID pandemic, we are again looking at phasing out of those measures that have been extraordinary. And government should work with civil society to ensure that these are phased out effectively and that there is transparency in the way the pandemic and the recovery phase is being implemented. Thank you.
Thank you, Florence, and thank you, Mariana. Here, I only highlight what Mariana said, that civil society has never been silenced, and that is something that we have to always remember, especially in this time of crisis. And as you mentioned, Florence, also the COVID pandemic and crisis show us that us as civil society organizations have to increase our role of watchdogs, because it's something that we must maintain and that really makes our democracy stronger, especially in this time of crisis. And I want to also to mention some comments and questions that the public are giving us through the chat box. And here, besides and along with everything that the panelists have said, some people say that we have also to take into account that during the pandemic, there were also not very democratic and transparent policies, because some of the countries were under populist governments. So by this, they also share not very democratic and transparent policies to cope with the COVID-19. So we have to take into account also this politics issue that the pandemic also showed us. No? And just to finish, we want to mention that also during the working groups, inside the working group, the 2030 Agenda and Development Working Group, we discussed enabling environment, and we did some recommendations to the G20 countries on this. So you can find those recommendations in the final policy paper that the C20 released. And so just to finish and take into account that the C20 is giving and always gives a recommendation to the G20 countries in many topics. In one sentence and in some ideas, what will be your recommendations to the G20 countries in terms of enabling environment and how they work during the COVID-19 with civil society organizations? What would you like to highlight so they can, if they are listening to us, what they should do in their own countries to preserve the enabling environment? I don't know who wants to start.
What I wanted to finish with, what I wanted to highlight was basically highlighted by everyone, but I think that's definitely the main message of this panel, is that despite all the restrictions, the hardships, the lack of support of civil society, COVID-19 has been proof that civil society brings so much value to citizens, to society, not just by providing services, but also by reacting to uphold the democracy and rule of law. And governments need to recognize this immense role that CSOs had in handling the pandemic, need to consult, involve them in all similar, let's say, crisis responses and management, because it showed that civil society can be and is a very relevant and irreplaceable partner to the state in reaching development objectives and goals.
Thank you, Anya. Who wants to continue?
Oh, sorry. Can I continue? Oh, Anya, you.
Yeah, you can continue, Harsh.
Yeah, I just wanted to say one thing, that, the major, if you see, origin of G20 was the economics, right? But one thing which is very clear, that the crisis which has shaken the world is more than the economics. And see, if we must say that civil society, the role which civil society has played in handling this and mitigation of COVID worldwide should be recognized. Because every country has gone through it. Every country has seen that how civil society has managed to it. In a country like India or many countries where civil society was not looking for resources, but even then they had worked so much. And we must say that in the past also, I know that in the past, wherever there has been crisis, civil society has responded. So this time also, I think there should be a mention in the official communique of G20 about the role of civil society globally in mitigating of COVID-19. That should be recognized. In my country, even my Prime Minister, who never liked civil society, recognized the role of civil society in his speeches. So that is the achievement I see for all of us, that how we work together. And I think there is need to, maybe, Civicus and ICNL should come together, and we should do a global documentation, some sort of a documentation globally to record the achievements of civil society, the contribution of civil society, not only to celebrate our sacrifices. And if India has lost 90 civil society frontline workers in a short span of 3 months, the world might have lost many. So we must recognize that, and we should come with a solid report globally about the contribution, about the struggle, about the innovation of global civil society community in mitigating COVID-19. I think these two things is my desire and aspiration, I think. Thank you.
Thank you, Harsh, for the idea. I like the report that you mentioned. Maybe we can work on that afterwards, but it's a good way of showing how civil society respond and help to face this crisis, that without civil society organizations, the crisis would be worsened. I don't know, Mariana, if Florence, you want to continue?
Definitely. I think we all have shared how fundamental and important civil society is, especially for post-pandemic world. So we call on the governments to lift all the restrictions on civil society to enable them to protect the space for civil society to operate and to stop the censorship and the lack of access to information, especially during the time of COVID, and to comply with international law. Even though we are facing a health emergency, there are clear standards that no government is complying to and are using the pandemic as an excuse to further restrict on rights.
And I will crown it by saying that it's important to underscore the fostering of the legal enabling environment for civil society. We need commitments from the G20 members on that. The pandemic has provided peculiar challenges for civil society. We are calling on the governments to support the sustainability of CSOs by addressing the resource challenges and how best to support them. It's also important to strengthen institutional mechanisms that oversee the executive branch, especially when dealing with the pandemic, where they have been weakened. It's important to include civil society in trying to strengthen these mechanisms and sharing of good practices to strengthen and uphold democracy. Thank you.
Thank you, Mariana and Florence. So we are on time. So before giving the word to Ricardo, who's going to finish our panel, I want to thank these wonderful panelists to giving us so many insights, share this information and ideas. And I was hearing all of you, and I was thinking that I can relate to everything that you said happening in your regions, in your country. So I feel we are not alone when you share this. And there's so much things going on, and we have to continue our work. And so thank you so much for being with us and sharing this information and for discussing this very important topic that we always must address in every C20 and in every political forums that we are and we participate. Is something that we have to mention, because is the paramount that we civil society workers are based on, and without in every environment we won't be discussing any other topic or any other issue. So thank you so much for all the information and insights. And Ricardo, I will let you finish the panel.
Yeah, thank you, Juliana. I thank everybody as well, and I thank you, Juliana, for moderating, but also for organizing this meeting. I would say three things taken from what you said. First, definitely, civil society is not just a system of organization that is able to provide services. We are used like that, but we are not only that. We are a part of our societies, and we try to provide the relation between the citizens, between men and women, and the politicians, our public institutions. That's the reason why we are ready when it's needed. In case of urgency, for instance, we are ready to provide services, but we want to be heard, because we want the citizens to be heard. And let me say that I'm very sad today that in our C20 Summit, we don't have the voice of the Italian presidency in this international part. We asked for that, and for a reason that are understandable, because these are the last days, the last weeks towards the G20 Summit. There is this exceptional meeting on Afghanistan that is planned for the 12th of October, and I understand all the difficulties, but I also see that in other meetings of other engagement groups, sorry to be so strong, several ministers of our government or a representative of the Italian presidency were present or are present in these very days or tomorrow and the next days for B20. And I think that civil society needs a different way to be considered, a different consideration. The second point is related to us. If we have this fundamental role to represent, sorry, I'm receiving a lot of messages and I'm not able to quit the voice. If we, let me say, pretend to represent the citizens in speaking with the public institution, and it is one of our duty, we have always to ask ourselves about our legitimation. We have to ask ourselves every day how much we are really representing, how much we are speaking with the people. Sometimes we risk to be an elite that make a sort of interpretation of the messages. That is needed, but I think that we should call ourselves every day to go on the ground, to speak with at the grassroots level, to involve the citizen, and not to speak on behalf, but to create the condition that let citizen speaking directly with our public institution. The third point is the invitation for the final session of the C20 Summit tomorrow at this very time. That is 4 o'clock in the afternoon in Europe, and a different time in all the other part of the world. We will have again 1 day of meetings. We will end at 3 o'clock p.m. with another C20 event dedicated to global health, and then at 4 o'clock we will release the final communique Arsh was referring to. You are all invited to be there. It will be a short session, just to say, here we have the final document. It will be published in the website, and I invite you to check it and also to read the policy pack that contains all the details of the recommendation that our working group developed during this year, and that are also the capital that will be used next year by our Indonesian friends and then by Indian friends to lead the C20 process in the next year. So you are all invited to be there, also to show that yes, we are also able, even with all our diversities, we are able to speak with one voice and to be together in the most important call, that is the call for dignity of human life, that is based on freedom and on the respect of the lives. So thank you, Juliana. Thank you, all the panelists. Thank you, all the attendees that are hearing us and seeing us on streaming. And let's meet again tomorrow.